Hi, my name is Kevin Thomas, W1DED. Today I'm with B. Dale Garby. B. Dale is the president of the Amateur Radio Digital Communications. ARDC is a private foundation that is charged in general with supporting and growing ham radio through innovation in a variety of different means. They, fortunately for ham radio, grant about $5 million a year to various organizations. They are the most significant funder of ham radio in the U.S. today. I'm very excited to talk to B. Dale today and understand more about the ARDC. B. Dale, thank you for joining me.
Yeah, good morning, Kevin. I'm happy to be here.
So I want to dive into the ARDC, but it would be a shame not to understand a little bit about your ham radio background. I know your call sign is KB0G. Tell me about that. When did you get licensed?
I first got licensed while I was a university student in the mid-'80s. A good friend, Mike Chaponis, K3MC, finally got me over the hurdle of getting a license. I started with an old school novice license and did the upgrade to technician. My first call sign as a novice was KA3ORU, and then I became N3EUA, hard to say and not all that exciting on the air as a technician. It wasn't until after I had moved to Colorado and gone to work for Hewlett-Packard sometime later that I took advantage of one of the first changes in the licensing stuff to become one of the first what I call slow code extras. I did all the written exams and got credit for my existing 5-word per minute that I'd passed as a novice and became KB0G then. So the zero, reflective of being in Colorado and really wanting to have a zero call. I always thought that was kind of a cool thing. That's pretty much how the licensing thing happened. In terms of things I've been involved in, unlike many of your guests, I don't spend a heck of a lot of time on HF. I enjoy dabbling from time to time. But my initial interest, the thing that finally got me over the hurdle to get a ham license, was the emergence of packet radio and the excitement I saw personally in being able to engage in computer-oriented communication over ham radio links. And then I got really interested in VHF and microwave weak signal stuff, and I used to go roving a lot in things like the August UHF and the various VHF contests. I did at one time hold the record for the highest score as a rover in the August UHF contest in the Rocky Mountain region. Was one end of some distance record setting attempts on microwave. It helps to have a 14,000 foot mountain just to the west of where I live near Colorado Springs to use as one end of microwave communications distance attempts like that. And then, over time, I think I probably am best known in the amateur radio world for some combination of helping to make Phil Karn's TCP/IP software work well for folks in amateur radio and elsewhere, and also for my contributions over the years helping to design and build pieces of amateur radio satellites.
So with all that, there's clearly an intersection with where the ARDC began. So why don't we segue right into that? What was the beginnings of the ARDC? Tell us that story.
So when the ARPANET was an ongoing research project and before it really became the internet, we got to the point in history where the current internet protocol version 4 address format came into use. And in the old days, they signed addresses on that net in blocks. And there happened to be some interested ham radio folks who were aware of what was happening with the emergence of this protocol set and thought it would be fun to play with it some over ham radio. And so they went to the powers that be and asked for a block of addresses for use by ham radio people, potentially worldwide. And sort of an indication of how different the world was then, the responsible parties assigned amateur radio all of network 44, which means, internet protocol addresses, version 4 are 32-bit addresses. So it's basically, here's the first 8 bits or 44, and then you've got 24 bits to play with. 2 to the 24th is like 16.8 million addresses. And so all of a sudden, ham radio had a whole bunch of numbers. At that point in history, nobody, I think, dreamed that those numbers would ever have any financial value. They were just, you had to have a unique one in order to play on the network. And ham radio was, a big enough potential consumer of interesting or producer of interesting ideas. We might consume some addresses over time. the powers that be thought giving us that Class A address block was a good plan. Roll forward in time, and that had not been assigned to a corporation or anything like that. It was just sort of set aside for ham radio. And when people started to realize that a 32-bit address space was not infinite, and we were eventually going to run out of addresses, and there was a perception that, that means addresses might get valuable, the powers that be suggested that the loosely organized group of ham radio people who were playing with those addresses might want to actually form some kind of an entity to be the legal holder of those addresses and prevent them from just being snagged at some point. And so that was when our founder, Brian Cantor, WV6CYT, formed Amateur Radio Digital Communications, and it was set up initially as an IRS-recognized 501c3 nonprofit organization, running as a public charity, had essentially no money, but had this asset, which was a block of Internet Protocol addresses. And over time, those addresses got to be really valuable. And so by the time we get to 2019, which was a long time from the 80s when we first started playing with this stuff, Brian and others recognized that there might actually be more value to the ham radio community overall if we were to take some portion of those addresses and turn them from being an asset consisting of a bunch of numbers into being an asset that was consisting of a bunch of money. And so the decision was taken to convert a quarter of that 16.8 million address space into something that would be offered commercially. And ultimately, a well-known internet services company chose to buy that. And I believe at the time it was the largest dollar figure paid per address for a large address block. And to sort of cut to the chase, when that whole transaction was done, the organization's net proceeds from that sale were approximately $109 million. So all of a sudden, we went from, maybe a couple $100 in the bank that people had donated to help make the organization able to exist to, oh my, that's a lot of money. We all have this desire to see it do great things for ham radio. Now what do we do? And that's about the time I joined the board. I had been involved in the whole experiment of working with TCP/IP protocols on ham radio almost from the beginning. When I first met Phil Karn at the first ever meeting of the Mid-Atlantic Packet Radio Council, and he and I and Mike Chaponas and Bob Hoffman were the four initial founders of the mailing list called TCP Group, which is the predecessor to today's 44net mailing list community. And up until April of 1989, I served as the sort of chief tester and documentation person for Phil's KA9Q TCP/IP package. And so through that whole, period of time, I had been somehow involved in these things. I had helped Brian from time to time when he was trying to figure out how to deal with the internet powers that be and sort of keep everybody calm and keep things working. And so I had been asked, for several years if I would be willing to join the board of directors and take an official role with the organization. And honestly, there were enough other things going on in my life that wasn't really a priority for me until all of a sudden the transaction happened and I looked and said, oh my, it's really, really important that the right things are done with that money and that this doesn't somehow end up being a mess. And so at that point, I agreed to join the board, and that happened in the fall of 2019.
Well, certainly a remarkable story and fortuitous for ham radio. And I guess I'm curious, who were those early hams that set aside those IP addresses so we can say thank you to them?
Yeah, the person whose name I know the best is Hank Magnuski. Hank actually served on our grants advisory committee when we were first setting up the granting program. There were a bunch of other folks, and I'm unfortunately not good at just rattling off names like that. Phil Karn was certainly in the middle of it relatively early because of his interest in developing software which would allow hams to actually use these protocols over packet radio. I remember that one of the key enabling moments was when Mike Chaponas wrote replacement firmware for the early Tapper TNC2 to allow it to run a protocol called KISS. which, yes, really meant keep it simple, stupid. It was a serial line protocol, so we could push IP frames, through TNCs, which, of course, the standard firmware for those was intended to be used entirely differently. I was one end of the first TCP/IP connection over amateur radio using a KISS TNC with Colonel Andrew Freeborn, N0CCZ, at the other end of the connection in Colorado Springs. Andy served for a time as the president of Tapper. He was a fascinating guy and had a real influence on me. I miss him from time to time. Lots of other people along the way. We could name drop all morning, but I'm sure you have other things we could talk about too.
So tell me about that progression from that morning when you wake up as the ARDC and realize you have $109 million worth of assets to where we are today. What was the evolution of ARDC? How did you get your footing, and what did you start doing early on, and how has that evolved over time?
Well, I think Brian Cantor had this notion as our founder of the organization. He had this notion that there were really two important things to do with that money. One was to sort of preserve and maintain the ability of hams to be able to use Network 44 and find more new and exciting things to do with it. And so that's continued to be one of the ongoing programs that ARDC engages in, is sort of maintaining and caring for the resources that are part of making that network useful to hams all over the world. And then the second big thing was, hey, if we had money, we could gift and grant it to people who had great ideas. I remember, Kevin, in I think it was 1989, we held one of the ARRL Tapper Digital Communications conferences at the U.S. Air Force Academy just north of Colorado Springs. And in fact, Andy Freeborn, who I mentioned a few minutes ago, was the one who was sort of the lead organizer of that event. And I got roped into ringleading a discussion on Sunday morning. We often had sort of, tutorials or other topics on the Sunday after the conference was mostly over. And the topic was sort of an open discussion about something we ended up calling DreamNet, which was this notion of, if we could do anything we wanted with packet radio, what was it we wanted to do? And, if you think back to 1989, for those of us who were around then, that's before the internet was a thing that everybody had access to. It was before most people had cell phones. In fact, before a whole lot of folks really knew what they were. And so at that point in history, we had this grandiose vision of, if we could just sort of have a digitally connected thing in our hand, there's all this cool stuff we could do. And I think what we were envisioning was kind of what today people see and think about when they pick up a smartphone and they've got the internet and they can look things up and they can video call with people and they can do things like we're doing right now. At that time, that was sort of crazy visionary stuff. And one of the sad realizations we had is we couldn't afford to do it. Nobody had money. We all understood that if you were a serious HF contester, for example, you'd be willing to spend some number of thousands of dollars, even in 1989, putting together a killer station to be able to go participate in contests and get great scores and have fun. But that was an investment you were willing to make in your own equipment. When we sort of looked around and said, now who's going to put up the money to build mountaintop repeaters so that I can talk from Colorado Springs to, I don't know, San Francisco? We were all left scratching our heads. And so it was simultaneously a really invigorating conversation and deeply depressing. And so part of what I think was exciting to me about ARDC all of a sudden having a bunch of money was the realization that and many other ideas that people had had over the years, where it was like, there's this great idea, but how could we ever do that? Because we'll never have the money to be able to do that. All of a sudden, maybe the answer could be, yeah, you could get the money to do that. And so then the really difficult part, honestly, as Phil Karn has often pointed out, people just have no idea how hard it is to give away money, particularly if you insist on doing it responsibly and trying to make a difference in the world.
Jump into that process. I'm curious how the grant review, vetting, approval process works. And again, how has that evolved over time?
Well, one of the things we realized very early on, and this was something that Brian also understood, was that this couldn't just be one or two people sitting there with a checkbook and making decisions. That wasn't responsible. It wasn't the right thing to do. It's really sad that before we actually got any of this stuff going, that Brian passed away unexpectedly in late 2019. And to be honest with you, the rest of us on the board at that time found ourselves sort of in a deep dive scramble to figure out how to, sort of pick up the pieces and carry on. And we made some decisions very early. One of them was that we needed help. And so one of the very first things we did was to hire an executive director, somebody who could sort of take responsibility for running whatever it is we came up with. And then the next thing we sort of made conscious decisions on was that, running some kind of a granting process was going to require some kind of a volunteer community to help us parse proposals and make good decisions. And so through a process of hiring some additional people over time and formalizing some of these volunteer committees, we've ended up with a situation where we sort of run quarterly granting windows where we invite people to send us proposals. We have a fair amount of information on our website explaining sort of how to go about doing that and what a good proposal should look like. We have a grants manager, Chelsea Parago, who is just absolutely amazing at running that process for us. And so people will submit proposals. They get a first pass vetting by our staff, our paid staff, to look for things like, are these even reasonable to have volunteers spend time reviewing? Do they meet a certain set of sort of minimal criteria for being acceptable proposals? Then they go to an all-volunteer grants advisory committee, and they go through all the proposals. They review them, they discuss them. We have a software system that we've actually spent money developing and improving that we use to sort of capture all of that information and build, sort of help the advisory team in their collation of opinions to form sort of, for each granting interval, here's the things that are obvious we should just say yes to. So here's like a block of things that the board will just say yes to. And then there are things that kind of don't make the cut line, but maybe the board of directors wants to look at those and maybe lift something up out of the dustbin. And then the ones that the board spends the most time on are the ones that are kind of around that cusp line. They're either proposals that are a large enough amount of money that we feel an extra responsibility to ensure that, those decisions sort of have all hands on deck as we're making them, or they in some way represent a controversial position or something like that, or where somebody on the board is perceived as maybe having some unique technical knowledge to bring to an analysis. And so the process is that, the grants come in, staff takes a quick look at them, the grants advisory committee does the hard work of reviewing all of them and sort of rank ordering them and putting them into accept, discuss, and reject buckets. And then the board of directors sort of has the final responsibility as the people with fiduciary responsibility to the organization to yay or nay that quarter's proposed actions. And once the board approves the grants they're going to approve, the money gets dispersed and off we go. There, of course, are a bunch of details along the way. Before we actually disperse the money, there's sort of contract terms to be accepted. That's sort of a requirement of making this stuff work well and keeping everything legal. But, for a small grant to a ham radio club to, replace a repeater that took damage in a hurricane or something, those terms are really simple. If you're proposing a multi-million-dollar research and development program in a university, you will not be surprised to get a more complicated contract.
So in the build-up to this conversation, I obviously talked to some people and did some research, and it seemed to me there were 4 broad categories of grants, and I just want to run them by you. You can tell me if I've got it right or not, but one seemed to be the growth of ham radio, a lot of it via clubs and organizations. Another was scholarships. Another was education. And another was technical. Are those basically the 4 categories that you're providing funding for?
That's certainly one way you could slice the data, and I think that makes pretty good sense. It sort of depends on how you define boundaries. Growth of ham radio, there are a bunch of things that we do that are supporting clubs, and most of that is really about sort of growing and preserving what we think of as ham radio today. And so I guess all of those things do sort of fit could be aligned in that category. It's been sort of interesting. We've run some experiments over time. When we were first getting started and we're trying to struggle to figure out how we're ever going to give away enough money to meet the IRS requirements, there was a time when grant proposals that weren't immediately, clearly, obviously well aligned with our mission might have been said yes to sort of experiment and see what benefit could be achieved. And we've learned a lot over time. We are really fortunate that we've had an incredibly low, quote unquote, failure rate of projects that were funded by the organization. I think we've now had I think we've done something like 315 total grants to date, representing about $30 million. In 2024, I think we funded something like 59 proposals at around $3.9 million. And of that 300 plus proposals, I think we've had a total of 6 that didn't get to the point of filing sort of an acceptable final report, which, if you do the quick math, means that's like less than a 2% failure rate, which is kind of amazing, honestly. One of the things that we instituted about a year ago was a new all-volunteer committee called the Grants Evaluation Team. And what they did in their first year was basically look at all of the grants we'd made so far, at least a bunch of them, and try to analyze, where was the most bang for the buck? What kinds of proposals sort of generated more good for the world than others? And we learned a few things from that, but there's a lot more to learn. I'm really looking forward to seeing what that team does for us this year as well. But all of those things, all these learnings and sort of observation of the results of the various experiments we've tried to run in the granting process get fed back and hopefully make us better at making good decisions in the future.
Well, certainly just the fact that you're tracking success and failure and you have a grants evaluation committee tells me that you're a very professionally run organization. So kudos to you for that.
I appreciate
I guess
that.
one of the things that I'd like to understand better, and I don't want to get into the failures as much as the successes. In your mind, what qualifies as a success? And maybe you want to use a couple actual examples, but what would be a success that is top of mind for you, say in 2023 or 2024?
I think that there's different ways you could think about that. One way that I think is really important to think about is, did the grantee meet the objectives they had set for themselves and articulated in the grant proposal they brought to us? So, for example, if a club along the Gulf Coast, suffered a bunch of hurricane damage to a bunch of repeaters that are, sort of important for them for maintaining communications in that community and being prepared for future emergencies, and they come to us with a really straightforward, we want to put up these 3 repeaters on these 3 mountaintops, and it's going to cost this amount of money to refurb those sites. Them just getting to the end of that grant and checking all the boxes and saying, yeah, we did all those things, it's all working, thank you ARDC, we're back in operation. That's an immense success. It's certainly meaningful to the folks that are involved. Phil Karn, for a while, was personally reading all the notes that came back from scholarship recipients that were receiving scholarships through things like the ARRL Foundation Scholarship Program, which we've been providing some sponsorship to for a set of scholarships. And he just conveyed to the rest of the board the immense joy he felt from students, being able to pursue their academic objectives and being able to do so in ways they might not have been able to if we weren't there. But I'll tell you personally, the projects I get most excited about are the ones that have the potential of having longer term, bigger impact on larger communities. So that could be, a research and development program coming up with some new codec technology, or, figuring out how to do a different kind of approach to HF digital communications. It could also be projects like HamSci. I've been very excited about our sponsorship of HamSci because here's citizen science being undertaken by ham radio operators, taking advantage of the spectrum that we have available and, their willingness to be sort of volunteer participants in scientific data collection and discovery. That kind of stuff's really exciting, and I think it goes a long way to justifying ham radio's continued access to spectrum and other resources. So we've identified various specific grants in things like our annual report. I think it was the USS Hornets radio room got some refurb, and it's really interesting. It's been an interesting learning that different people have, for example, really different constraints doing something like fixing an antenna. If you are, for example, an individual ham radio club, repairing a repeater on a mountaintop, maybe all you need is an antenna and some feed line and some connectors, and some volunteer will go climb the tower and fix the thing. If you are a student ham radio club at a university, the university probably won't allow a student to go climb a tower and work on an antenna. So all of a sudden now you've got to have, some third-party firm has to be contracted to come in and do the work. And then if you're like a historic site, like, former military naval vessel sitting at dock somewhere, you have all of those issues plus the how do we not hurt the poor tourists who are coming to visit the site, and maybe there's extra constraints because people have to hang out over the water to do things or whatever.
All legitimate concerns.
Yes, and so what this means is this is part of why there has to be a human element in this whole grant analysis process, right? Because every once in a while, if you just took a grant proposal and looked at it in a vacuum, you'd go, what in the heck does it need that much money to do that thing for? And then you unwind it and you go, oh, right, okay. That's an interesting set of constraints. And then the question is the result going to be something that's meaningful enough that it's worth funding anyway? I've seen a lot of interesting successes. We have such a diverse range of grants. As I mentioned, I think the HamSci stuff is particularly interesting to me. And I'm also really proud of the fact that we've been able to provide significant sponsorship for things like ARIS, the amateur radio on the International Space Station program. Impacts a lot of kids. It's a very high profile, very visible activity that's promoting amateur radio and sort of the spirit of cooperation and connectedness that I think is important for us to keep going long term. So there's a lot of good stuff there.
B-Dale, you mentioned earlier that in the early days of the ARDC, once you had the assets that you were able to get from the sale of the IP addresses, sounds like you were working hard to push the money out the door to meet the IRS requirement. I presume, with everything you've told me, that your priorities maybe have shifted some over time. As you've gotten better at the process, maybe you're not pushing the money out the door, looking harder for the right project. How have those priorities shifted over time, and what do you find you and your team being more or gravitating more toward?
Yeah, that's a really good question. When we were first getting started, one of the things that we were faced with is that when you all of a sudden have a whole pile of financial assets and you're no longer subsisting as a nonprofit on the basis of public donations, like the Red Cross or somebody goes out and solicits donations and use those to go do good things in the world. That's the kind of 501c3 nonprofit organization that most people in the U.S. think of when they think of a nonprofit. But when you all of a sudden have a big pile of assets, you transition to the form of a nonprofit called a private foundation. And private foundations have a bunch of rules that I think were originally set up to ensure that, wealthy families didn't just hide a bunch of money under the name of a foundation and go do whatever they wanted to with it while pretending that it should be tax exempt. And so one of those rules is that we have to distribute a minimum of 5% of our assets each year. Now, that sounds bad at first because it's like, well, that means you're not going to be around very long. But of course, those who understand the process of creating investment plans and managing a portfolio that has, 9 figures in it, your goal is always to generate enough income from that investment portfolio to more than overcome that 5% minimum distribution requirement. And in fact, we've been really successful at that because, as I said, we started with roughly $109 million, and I believe that even in the sort of weird market conditions we're in right now, the current balance is like 120, and in that time we've given away something like $30 million. So on some level it's working, but one of the things that happened early on we really were unsure how we were ever going to be able to give that much money away. And until we built a staff that understood how to do this, and until we had volunteer committees in place who were happily getting together and spending their time helping to review proposals and analyze them for us. In the early days, it was sort of like, oh, that seems like a good idea. Let's put some money behind that. And what's happened over time is that people have come to realize that, oh, we are here. We do really have a big bucket of money. And if there's a good idea, you should come to us and ask us. And the side effect of that is that we're now down to where only about 30% of the incoming grant proposals are actually able to be funded. And the interesting thing is, if you look at it, we had a year or two where we were more generous than we needed to be under the IRS regs. And the way the IRS works is if you give away more than the required minimum distribution as a private foundation, you're allowed to carry sort of that positive balance forward into succeeding years. If you fail to distribute enough, you have to very quickly, like in the next year, make that up. And so it's sort of biased towards this notion that generosity should be rewarded, which feels good. But what we realized at some point is that just looking at the bank balance and going, oh, it was 109 and now it's 120 and we've given away a bunch, from a straight dollar standpoint, that seems pretty good. But if you factor in the effects of inflation and you think about what the purchasing power in 2019 was of the balance then and the purchasing power today of 120 million, it's not so great. And so what the board decided was to dial the knob down a little bit and get closer to actually sort of meeting the minimum requirement, not being overly generous, as a way of preserving the value of the portfolio, not only in simple dollar figures, but in sort of purchasing power after inflation kind of terms. All of that's kind of boring. Nobody really cares. But what it means is over time, we have become more selective. But it's not really that we've changed our priorities as much as we've started to understand that there are some kinds of proposals that are more likely to provide more benefit to more people. And those might therefore, be more desirable, particularly if they're large requests. At the same time, we continue to want to aid and abet the growth and preservation of ham radio, which often means saying yes to modest requests from ham clubs for things they need to make their local community better and to attract more participants. And of course, there's this sort of undercurrent all the time of education is a really important thing, whether it's, teaching ham radio classes to, kids in middle school, or whether we're talking about lifelong learning and the kind of thing that all of us, I hope, as ham radio folks are sort of technically interested and curious enough to want to keep learning.
So I'm really curious what your thoughts are about the future of ham radio, because it seems as though everything you're doing really at its core not only is funding the future of ham radio, but it's also dependent upon it. It doesn't make sense to be doing education and funding clubs and innovating if there's not enough ham radio operators around to take advantage of it. In some ways,
right.
There's a corollary between that statistic and even your portfolio. To have a healthy ham radio community, we need to see those numbers growing. So there is a lot of conversation going on ever since I got back into ham radio a couple of years ago about the future of ham radio. What is the ARDC's take on the future of ham radio, and how do you think that you can best impact that?
Yeah, you have the easy questions all the time, don't you? So the interesting thing is I've heard people talking about, the potential death of ham radio since I joined the hobby in the 80s. It's been a persistent concern. And look, part of the reason is that I think historically and even today, the ham radio community demographic leans heavily towards, older male, a lot of retirees, a lot of folks that are, at the empty nester stage or beyond, where frankly, they've got more free time. They've maybe got some disposable income. All of those things actually matter for hobbies. After all, ham radio for a lot of folks really is a hobby. It can also be an immense, source of personal gratification for participating in public service things and so forth. So I think part of what I'm trying to say is it's not like this is a new phenomenon. It's been around forever. And there are really a couple of things that I think we've been trying to do about this. One is we really are trying to be an international organization and not just U.S. centric. After all, the internet is worldwide. The TCP group community and its follow-on, the modern 44net community, are truly international. And if you look at the distribution of our grant money over time, I think we're to the point where last year something like 25% of the grants we made by grant count were outside of the U.S. So that's one part of it, is trying to make sure that this is that part of our vision that's about a thriving global community is really true. Another piece is about trying to entice people who are not currently part of the ham radio milieu to come and join us and play along. And that's where, looking for communities of people that have been overlooked for one reason or another, or, trying to do things that sort of reach into student communities that would not have necessarily thought about ham radio before. All those sorts of things are important. But one of our board members made the observation not long back that there's also nothing really wrong with leaning into our strengths. And, to some extent, what that means is if there are particular human demographics that align well with ham radio, as evidenced by who ham radio currently is, we shouldn't not pursue more people in that demographic. And so that's why, we have this sort of ongoing interest in things, in grant proposals that sort of provide more enthusiasm for people that are already part of the ham radio hobby, or provide learning opportunities, or make it easier for people to entice and drag in their friends. Because I think we need everybody. We need more people like us being part of the hobby. We need a lot more people that aren't quite like us being in the hobby. We need to not limit ourselves in our thinking about sort of who the target audiences are. One of the interesting things about being part of ARDC is that I don't know what the right way to say this is. We don't do a lot of work ourselves. We are all about other people with good ideas coming to us, and we maybe have the opportunity to provide them resources, whether it's dollars, or maybe it's address space. In the modern era, with internet version 4 addresses becoming hard to come by, a significant asset we can offer to certain sub-communities is just access to address space. And so those are all things that, I think we can apply. I think one of the common threads and discussions among the board members is that all of us feel like ham radio in some way really helped us have the careers that we wanted to have, and helped us be able to sort of do the things we wanted to be able to do as individuals and make an impact in the world. And we really hope over time that that's something that more people can be exposed to and have the ability to feel as well.
B. Dale, when you look at the grant applications, I'm curious how many, and I'm not looking for you to quantify it, but generally, are there many visionaries in that stack of applications? I mean, from listening to you talk, you have what I'd consider infrastructure. Fix the repeater, fix the antenna, build
Right.
the station at the university. You have another category of innovation, which is, by definition, is vision. But beyond that, how many are visionary toward the future of ham radio? Are you getting ideas or plans from people that really have big ideas to expand the hobby, to build upon our strengths, to add more people at any age group? I love what you said about older people. Obviously, it makes sense that we're involved with the hobby because we have some disposable income, we have time. It makes sense. And I love what you're saying also, that maybe there's somebody that isn't my age, that's in their early 40s, that if they just had a bit of encouragement, they would also do it. I think sometimes there's maybe a large proportion of attention given to getting youth involved, which I'm all for, but we're kind of missing the categories of people that can do it. But getting back to my question, are you seeing very many what I'd consider visionary plans that you and your grants team looks at and says, oh my God, we've got to get these people in right away?
So one of the things that's a little tough about answering that question, Kevin, honestly, is that as a board member, I don't actually read all the grant proposals that come in. I actually believe very strongly in this notion that when we've put together an amazing pool of talent participating in something like our grants advisory committee that it's really important to let them be pretty independent in that process. And so the grant proposals I see tend to be the ones that have made it through the vetting process and are to the point of needing a final approval. Though every once in a while, someone will flag a proposal as either being something they think I personally should go take a look at for one reason or another, or, for whatever reason, I'll go look. Every once in a while, it's because I have heard through the grapevine that somebody I know has, put in a proposal. I'm just curious to see what it is. But part of the process we've built is one where, favoritism just kind of doesn't exist. It's a very balanced process with a lot of checks and balances in it. I think some of the things that we've seen some interesting approaches to education, particularly, childhood education. One of the things that I think we've wished sometimes is that some of the proposals that were really interesting in sort of a local area were more convertible into something that lots of people could do, which is why in our recent strategic work as a board, one of the high value areas we identified as sort of a priority for future granting is open source education. And there we're really talking about things like, curriculum development, things that, would create assets that could be used by lots of different people in different places at different times. Scalable hands-on projects that clubs could take on to get more people actually playing with electronics or figuring out how to actually use, new modulation and coding schemes, actually trying a digital voice contact for the first time or whatever. One of the places where I think there's an opportunity for us to help fan the flames more over time is to take things that seem innovative and cool, but are at a sort of really small area of focus. Somebody who's had a great idea for how to do a thing at their school or in their community or for their club, and try and figure out how to convert more of those into things other people can really learn from. Our staff has been talking about, having more gatherings of existing grantees to sort of share the results of their work and talk to each other and kind of present to each other. And I guess I have a hope that in the same way that I know people go back and look at videos of talks that I've given and other people have done at things like, Linux conferences around the world, that could over time become a body of inspiration or good ideas that could be picked up and shared. But I think in terms of, I think that's probably the closest I can come to a useful answer there. I'm fascinated from time to time when somebody has an interesting technical proposal. As sort of a geek engineer myself, I kind of get excited when somebody has a cool new thought. Unfortunately, with a bunch of really technically strong folks on the board, we often pick those to pieces and spend a lot of time with it. Yeah, that's been done before. That's a cool idea, and if it could actually work, it'd be great, but there's these little laws of physics that are unlikely to allow that to be a thing that happens. It's always a balancing act, right? You have people with great ideas. I remember there's one of those proverb things, man who say it cannot be done should not interrupt man doing it, or something like that, or get in the way of the man doing it. So there's a balance in all of these things, but we do see some interesting proposals, but in terms of how to actually get more great stuff to come in. I mentioned open source education. We've done some funding of some space related projects, some CubeSat projects and things like that. The ones that have really gotten our attention have tended to be ones where there's some real tie-in to either community development or educational processes or something. The board generally would love to see, more interesting proposals for things that involve space assets. We've seen a lot of enthusiasm in Europe where MSAT-DL has managed to get, a high orbit, geosynchronous capability. Because all of a sudden it kind of lowers the barrier to entry and more people can play with that, and there's a resource that's just available all the time to experiment with. It'd be cool to see some of that kind of stuff available over North America, but there are big hurdles to making stuff like that happen. And for us to see a proposal that's something we'd be willing to fund, it will require some innovative thinking or, a recognition that there's an approach that we maybe haven't thought about before.
Well, I do love the idea of scaling. And I think as you were talking about things that are scalable, it does make me think about all the people I've talked to. And there are visionaries in in certain states or in certain communities or with certain clubs, I don't think they've necessarily thought about how they could scale upwards. And we talk a lot about clubs getting better and how some clubs are underperforming, but I've talked to some club members that have amazing clubs. And if you could just kind of package what they do and offer that as education to
Yes.
somebody else, that why couldn't you do that times 10, times 20, times 30? So I think you're onto something with the scalability for sure. Badil, if you were to look ahead, say 5 to 10 years, what would you hope ARDC would be known for in 5 or 10 years? And how would you have evolved in that period of time?
I think, first off, I hope that we're still here and still doing great work. I don't know that I personally will be part of the organization forever. Let's face it. There are lots of really smart people in the world, and I hope that we have, a rich and robust evolution of who the people are that are involved. The board of directors recently went through an exercise where we articulated an actual vision statement for ARDC, and then from that developed some strategic objectives. And I think that vision, if the easiest way I can answer your question is to say that if we are successful at doing what we're trying to do, our vision would come true. And that vision is that, if we're successful, we would see a thriving global community of learners, experimenters, and contributors advancing freedom with open source communication and information technology. And so, what I'm hoping we're driving towards and what I'm hoping we're helping make happen is people all over the world being able to use amateur radio and related digital communications technologies available in unlicensed spectrum to build community, to collaborate with each other, to make their communities better, to make the world a better place. And if we're successful in any small way at making that happen, then I'll feel like all the effort we've put into this and the ongoing work of our staff and all of our volunteer committees is worthwhile.
Badil, given what you have accomplished as an organization and how professional you have created this foundation, my bet is that you will accomplish that.
I hope so. I really do.
I really appreciate you taking the time today.
Thanks, Kevin. It's been a pleasure chatting with you. And look, I really appreciate, I commented in our recent, in my closing letter in our recent annual report, that every time I have a chance to interact with our volunteer committees, I'm just reminded and sort of astounded at the caliber of individuals and the amount of energy that they are committing to try and make ARDC work. And I feel profoundly grateful to all of those people. And anyway, really appreciate your interest and everyone else's interest in ARDC and hope we can keep doing great things.
My name is Kevin Thomas, W1DED. I've been talking to Badil Garbi, the president of the ARDC. You really need to go to their website and check this organization out. If you haven't heard about them, it's time to find out about them. Doing great work for Ham Radio. Thanks again, Badil.
Thank you, Kevin.